What's up, internet? Welcome to Mo's Garage. In today's video, we're replacing the brake pads and rotors on this 2020 Toyota Corolla. Alright, so the first thing we want to do to get started is to go ahead and remove the wheel from the vehicle. I've already gone ahead and I've loosened the lug nuts using a breaker bar, and I've lifted the vehicle using a jack and a jack stand. Now, for those of you who may have never done this before, I lifted up the vehicle by using a jack with a piece of wood, and I jacked up from the subframe. Then over here, there's a notch on the pinch weld where your jacking point is, and that's where I've gone ahead and I've put the jack stand. So now with that out of the way, let's go ahead and remove the wheel. Alright guys, so now that we have the wheel off, let's go over to the driver's seat. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and stick our key and turn the car to the on position without starting it. Then we're going to turn our wheel all the way to the passenger side until it locks. And then we can take our key out, and then we can resume working on the brakes. Okay, so the reason we turned the steering wheel all the way to the passenger side is so that this rotor will turn along with the brake assembly, and now we have better access to the bolts right here. These two are going to be two 14mm bolts that we have to remove in order to get the caliper off the vehicle. Alright guys, so now that I have the caliper off, I just have this bungee cord that I'm going to use to hook up the caliper up to the strut. That way there's no pressure on the brake line. Then we can go ahead and take our brake pads. The next thing to do is to remove these two 17mm bolts right here so that we can remove this caliper bracket. Alright guys, so now that we have the caliper bracket off, we can go ahead and remove the rotor. Sometimes these guys are stuck to the hub, so you might need to hit them a couple times with a hammer. At this point, what you want to do is you want to clean the hub, and we're going to do that using a wire wheel, a paper towel, and some brake clean. Alright, once you have this nice and clean, we want to take some anti-seize. You want to take just a tiny little bit. You want to apply it to the hub. You just need a thin layer of this stuff, not a whole lot. But basically, this is also going to help to make sure that the rotor doesn't stick to the hub in the future when we go to remove it. Alright guys, now that we have the hub nice and cleaned and ready for the rotor, the next thing we want to do is we want to take the new rotor and we want to compare it to the old rotor, make sure that they're about the same. Basically, you just want to make sure they're approximately the same thickness, they have the same lug pattern, and that they're about the same diameter from top to bottom. So this looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and get this guy cleaned up so we can install it on the vehicle. Alright, so to clean the brake rotor, all you really want to do is you want to spray it down with some brake clean. Then you can go ahead and rub it down with a nice clean paper towel. You want to do that on both sides, this side and this side, until your paper towel comes out clean. The reason you need to clean these guys is because there's a protective oil on here that keeps the rotors from rusting while they're in storage. Alright, now that we have our rotor cleaned, we can go ahead and put it on the wheel hub. Then we can take a couple of lug nuts and just thread them on to keep the rotor in place. Just like that. Alright, so at this point what we want to do is we want to go ahead and reinstall the caliper bracket back onto the vehicle, but before I do so, I do want to take a second to clean this up. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take off these caliper pins. Alright, and now I'm going to go ahead and hit it with that same wire wheel and some brake clean to clean it up the rest of the way. Alright guys, so now that I have this cleaned up as best as I can, it's time to go ahead and clean out these holes and clean out the guide pins and the rubber boots of all of the previous brake grease. For the bushings, all you really need to do is hit them with some brake clean on the inside and on the outside. Then you can just wipe them down with a paper towel. To get the inside grease, you can just go ahead and squeeze a paper towel through. Then we can do the same thing to the guide pin. Just wipe it down with a paper towel, hit it with some brake clean, and then wipe it off again. Now to clean the inside of these brake caliper holes, typically what you want to do is you want to use some brake clean with a brush that'll fit in here. But I don't have a brush, so I'm just going to use a paper towel and some brake clean. All right, so you want to make sure you hit this thoroughly. Make sure you get it nice and clean. Now, I don't know how well you guys can see in there, but it looks pretty clean to me. And if we compare that over here to this side, it's a lot cleaner. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the top side off camera, and then I will catch you guys afterwards. All right guys, now that everything is nice and clean, it's time to go ahead and reinstall these pieces back onto the caliper bracket. Now before we get started, it's important to note where you took off the pins. In this case, I kept the top side on the top and the bottom one on the bottom. And it's also important to make sure that the caliper bracket is in the same orientation as you took it off. In my case, the holes were on the top, so now we just can go ahead and get started. So the first thing we wanna do is we wanna go ahead and install our bushings. Just like that. All right, then we want to take some silicone brake grease and we're going to go ahead and add that to the guide pin. You don't need a whole lot. And you also want to make sure you don't get any on the tip, because otherwise you won't be able to compress the guide pin all the way. Now you just got to lather this on, make it nice and even, get this little rubber piece, and then we can go ahead and reinstall it. Once you get it in here, you want to go ahead and twist this guy in. That way all of the grease can go in there smoothly. And now we're just going to do the same thing to the top. All right, let's go ahead and put this guy in. All right, once you're done, you should be able to check the guide pins, make sure that they go in and out nice and smoothly. Make sure they bounce back out, and that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and reinstall this on the car. All right guys, so now it's just a matter of putting everything back together, and it's just the opposite procedure of removal. So let's go ahead and get our caliper bracket and a bolt. And let's go ahead and install this guy to the vehicle. All right, now we can do the bottom one. Once we have it screwed on almost all the way, we're gonna go ahead and torque this guy to 79 foot-pounds. All right, now once we're at this point, we can go ahead and add our hardware. All right, so now we're ready to install our new brake pads, but before we do so, we got to press in this brake piston for the caliper. So what we're going to do is we're going to take an old brake pad, and then we're going to compress it using a C-clamp. And then you know you have it all the way in once. You can't turn this anymore. Just like that. Alright guys, so up next we're going to work on the inner brake pad, and the first thing you want to do is you want to go ahead and install this low brake pad indicator. One goes on the top, one goes on the bottom, just like that. Then before installing it, we can go ahead and add a little bit of brake grease to both tabs, and then a little bit on the back shim. Go ahead and spread that around. Then we can go ahead and install this guy. Just like that. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get the other, add a little bit of brake grease in here, a little bit of brake grease in here. All right, go ahead and install it. Then we can add more brake grease to the back shim. All right, at this point, we wanna go ahead and take the caliper, unhook it, and we're gonna go ahead and kind of set it into place. You might need to push these guide pins in a little. Then we're gonna go ahead and install the top bolt. All right, then we can go ahead and install the bottom bolt. All right, then we can go ahead and snug these up. Then I believe the torque spec for these guys is 25 foot-pounds, but I'm just gonna tighten them up nice and snug. Now, if your guide pins start spinning when you're tightening these nuts, you can always use a 17mm wrench in here or some channel locks to get that to stop moving. All right, once you have those bolts nice and snug, we can go ahead and put the wheel back on and you're done. All right, guys, so there you have it. We have successfully replaced the brake pads and rotors on this 2020 Toyota Corolla. Overall, the process was not too difficult and it should take you about 20 minutes per side. Now, with that out of the way, thank you guys so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.